Chess Diagnostic.
Hello everybody. Today I'm going to analyze a game that was played recently between Hou Yifan and Fabiano Caruana at a 2017 event that's actually going on right now in Germany. So Hou Yifan is rated 2649. She's the strongest active female player currently, but Fabiano Caruana is, I think, number 3 in the world, and she was able to beat him with what looked like a simple game. But upon analysis, it's actually very complicated. But it looks like the principles of activity were clearly demonstrated in this win here. So that's why I wanted to analyze it. Just looking at it looked very interesting. So it starts off with e4. Yifan is white and Caruana is black. So it looks like they're heading towards a lopez, a Berlin defense. Now, instead of just trading off and going straight into the ending with bishop to e7 and bishop to f1, we keep all the pieces on the board and we go for a more normal position, a more tactical middle game. So in this position from the opening, they're basically just accomplishing the 3 main opening tasks of developing the pieces, castling the king, and then connecting the rooks. Now, because of this, or because of black's difficulty with actually connecting his rooks, you can see that instead he creates weaknesses, and it's from those weaknesses that Yifan is able to exploit the heirs. So the knight moves back, of course, to protect d4, but another possible move was just to play c3. But it looks like the idea of knight to f3 is actually just to prevent a trade-off, because now not only does white protect d4, but he prevents a trade-off, and it makes black just a little more cramped. Now these are the kind of intricacies in moves that you'll see extremely strong chess players make. And unless you're able to analyze them with a good understanding, you won't really understand what they're doing. Because if a player sees, okay, why did she move the knight back? Isn't that a move back? Well, it actually accomplishes 2 things. It protects d4, and it prevents black from gaining more space, more development, and it's just a slight move, but every little advantage adds up in chess. Alright, so she does play c3, and she's trying to figure out where to place this knight to get it, because this knight is always a hard knight to develop in the lopez, especially with bishop to f1. Normally, you'll bring the knight along here in kind of a W formation, if we do that, bringing it to g3 or to e3. But this specific position, it's a little more difficult. So he brings the knight back. It looks like, of course, he's going to play c6, but also to bolster the king side. Possibly playing knight to g3, but this knight is a little awkward here. Alright, so finally we have this kind of king side battery with the queen and the bishop, and black reinforces his king side with g6, but it does create a weakness. Now you notice that the strategic goal of bringing this knight, we've started that, and the idea, we're still in the opening, is to bring the bishop out and then eventually connect the rooks, doubling on the e-file. Okay, if you notice here, the computer's suggesting knight to g6. Now the reason for that is, well, of course, white would play here, but it actually allows the bishop to come out much easier than in the game. So Fabiano Caruana makes a slight error and plays f6, creating another weakness. Now, I just want to make a point that pawn moves they only benefit you when your piece activity supports the pawns. Now, if your pieces, namely here for black, the rook and the light square bishop, if they're sitting over here inactive, then that's a much bigger issue than moving some pawns. So his main focus should have been to figure out how to develop his pieces. So in the opening, if you can present your opponent a problem with developing his pieces, it's just as good as developing your own. All right, so h3. Now, with h3, an idea is to bring the pawn up, but it also helps restrict black's activity. Now, we would love to play our bishop out here, but of course the bishop's covering it. But we can always just bring the bishop up one square and then figure out later where to do it. So black makes the same idea of just bringing his bishop up, but his queen doesn't really have anywhere to go. All right, so it looks like black is trying to play in the center and gain some more space, but after the trade here, Hou actually brings her own bishop, and you'll see that she just gained activity. So the bishop gained this diagonal, but now she's able to bring her knight out. So Hou achieved her strategic goal of doubling rooks on the e-file as well as connecting rooks. Black has not accomplished these same tasks, so he's slightly behind, and that's why the computer is giving him almost a +1 advantage. All right, so with g5, there's two drawbacks to this move. First off, it creates another weakness. It creates holes all around the king, and it kind of forces a trade of a defender on the king side. Oh. So after knight, or after g5, Hou brings her knight up, and then there's a forced trade. So now this bishop is cutting in to the black queen side. So it's an active bishop, and that was actually her worst piece. So Fabiano Caruana could have played g4 trying to activate this bishop, but he makes a mistake of not doing that, and he makes more weaknesses by trying to play on the queen side, which is incorrect. Yifan moves her queen over because she's anticipating to eventually bring it over to the king side and exploit these weak pawns. So the idea of this is just to try to push a pawn and create weaknesses on the king side, namely undermine the c3 pawn. But after b4, en passant capture, and here, then actually there's no problems at all with white's queen side. So he's desperately trying to get his pieces out, but it's still very difficult for black. In these types of positions, with multiple weaknesses, you can see he already has 2 pawn islands here, very weak pawns, as well as white having total domination of this e-file, which she later uses to penetrate. Alright, so you can see that with h4, white has started to undermine the king side. So let's go back a sec here. It looks like the computer's suggesting b4, which very slight, but white plays it anyway. It's basically just to chase back the bishop. If he goes here, it's kind of awkward, and he wants this dark square bishop to protect the dark squares on the king side. So after a trade, you can see that these weak pawns, as well as the king, is just sitting bare. Now, Hou's strategy is to basically undermine the king side and use the e-file to penetrate. She brings her queen up, which was the idea of queen to d2, and she starts pressing all these weaknesses. hitting this pawn. Now, with so many weaknesses, with so many weak pawns, you can see that f6 was played. If he didn't play f6, if he would have played knight to g7, he wouldn't have this weakness right now. Of course, she could just take a pawn, but she wants to increase the activity of her rooks and start attacking the king. Of course, this prevents the skewer because black was threatening here. Now you see that if he just played this now, then the bishop's not covering g3, so he can actually check. And after this trade, Yifan has won a pawn, and it's very difficult. Probably another one will fall soon. All right, so you can see that, let's go back here. After b4, the king comes up. The bishop increases his activity and is controlling rook to e8. Now, there's really no way for Caruana to prevent this invasion. White completely owns the e-file. Bishop to c7 is listed as a mistake, and it's actually plus 7.9 for white. This move, bishop to f5, it looks like just trying to add a piece on the king side, but it's still plus 5.2, and the rook's coming in anyway. Now, rook to e8 is actually listed as a mistake. Bishop to e8 from this position here. So after the bishop moves back, she could play bishop to e8, winning the exchange. And it looks like white actually ends up a queen versus two pieces here at the end of the line. You can see that at the end of this computer line, he's winning either way, or she's winning either way. All right, so black is desperately trying to trade off some pieces, but this is another point, is when you have greater activity and when your opponent has a lot of weaknesses, you want to maintain all of the tension, because you can take your time when you have greater activity. And the reason for that is because your opponent won't, when all of his defenses are stretched, won't have the time to defend everything. All right, so we're just going through moves here. It's pretty much black trying to trade pieces, white trading a few. Of course, the computer's saying he could bring his rook in here, and it's actually naming mate in 15. But after bishop takes g3 and queen to g4 check, it's actually a forced mate after here in 8. Just because of these weaknesses here. This file, the rook can come in, as well as the rook can come in here. Now you notice that the queen's sitting over here completely inactive, and the rooks are quite inactive as well. So the mate would go and now he'll bring his rook. Now of course he could take, but that would just be a quicker mate like here. And we get checkmate. If he moves the pawn up, then we're actually going to be checkmating anyway. Of course, he would give a rook up, or he'd give his queen up. But the checkmate would go here. If you want to solve it, you can. Try to figure it out. After rook takes queen and queen to h6, then mate next move. But the game actually ended with queen to h3 check, because Fabiano Caruana saw that it would be mate and there was nothing he could do. All right, so in recap, if we go through this complicated middle game position, you can see that everything extended from the opening. Basically, his opening errors of not being able to develop this rook and this bishop. And this is why activity is so important, is because if you don't develop and your opponent does, it sounds so simple, so simple. But if you do it and your opponent doesn't, no matter how strong you are, no matter your rating, if you're 2800, if you don't develop your pieces, then you're playing multiple pieces down. And you can see it looks so simple here. Yifan Hou is just developing her pieces, wanting to get this knight out. She's using every move to increase her activity, while black is playing passively. Now, these kinds of moves you see a lot of times. Amateurs will play them. They'll make a pawn thrust, but it actually weakens their position, and then the opponent who's stronger just captures everything and then trades down and wins in the endgame. Well, here you can see that black is just making pawn moves, not really focusing on developing all the pieces. Now at this point, after everything's traded, all these weaknesses from multiple pawn moves instead of developing come back to haunt Fabiano Caruana. The queen's attacking here. The rook's up. Move back, further decreasing his own activity. B4 cuts off this bishop. Bishop to B5, bringing the rook in. Here's a threat, protecting his bishop, as well as threatening to come over to swing over the king side. So he does trade, but again, you can see she's just increasing her activity, and game over. It looks so simple, but when you analyze it, it's very complicated. So I hope my description helped you try to figure out what's going on in this game. I really enjoyed looking at this game, and it's fascinating to me when a strong, incredibly strong player is beaten in such a simple manner, because even if you learn every opening, everything that you could possibly know, if you don't follow the base strategic principles of activity, you lose, and that's what happened here. All right, so if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments, I guess, and subscribe. Just let me know what you think of this analysis, and I'll see you in the future.